America in the 1970s didn't feel confident, it didn't feel powerful, and it didn't feel certain about the future. This was a decade when people stopped trusting leaders, stopped believing promises, and started asking difficult questions. Gas lines stretched for blocks, crime filled the headlines, families gathered around the television, watching a country change in real time. Some say the 1970s broke America, others say it forced America to grow up. This is the story of a decade that changed everything. The 1970s began with hope, but also exhaustion. America was coming out of the 1960s, a time of protests, assassinations, and cultural revolution. Young people wanted freedom, older generations wanted stability, and the country stood somewhere in between. Factories were still running, suburbs were growing, but underneath it all, something felt fragile. The optimism of the post-war years was fading. Life was still recognizably American, with backyard barbecues and drive-in movies, but the easy confidence was gone, replaced by a sense of unease that lingered just below the surface. People were looking for a new normal, but nobody was quite sure what that looked like. For years, the Vietnam War had played out on American television screens, not as a distant story, but as nightly footage of chaos, loss, and confusion. By the early 1970s, Americans were tired, not just of the war, but of being told everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The gap between official statements and the reality shown on the news grew wider every day. This wasn't a war fought by heroes in black and white newsreels. It was a conflict in color, broadcast into living rooms, showing the human cost in stark detail. When the war finally ended, relief didn't follow. Instead, there was a profound silence, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong, and no one quite knew how to fix it. The soldiers came home not to parades, but to a nation deeply divided and uncertain how to heal. Then came the moment that changed how Americans viewed power forever, the Watergate scandal. It began as a strange news story about a break-in and unraveled into a crisis of leadership. For the first time, many Americans saw undeniable proof that the highest office in the country could lie, conspire, and cover up crimes. The daily hearings became must-see television, a slow-motion political drama that held the nation captive. When Richard Nixon resigned, it wasn't just a political event, it was deeply emotional. Trust in government collapsed almost overnight. People began to question everything, and once trust is broken, it never fully returns the same way. A layer of cynicism was baked into the American consciousness. The 1970s weren't just politically unstable, they were financially stressful. Inflation rose to dizzying heights, making every trip to the grocery store a painful experience. Jobs that once felt secure suddenly seemed uncertain, and then the oil crisis hit, making everyday life harder in a way no one had anticipated. People waited in long, tense lines just to buy gas, with tempers flaring and frustration mounting. Lights were turned off to save energy. Thermostats were lowered. Money was watched carefully, with families poring over budgets at the kitchen table. For many, the American dream of endless upward mobility no longer felt guaranteed. The future suddenly felt smaller and more precarious. Cities like New York became symbols of this widespread anxiety. Crime rose, and the headlines screamed danger. Stories of muggings, graffiti-covered subways, and urban decay filled the nightly news. People locked their doors earlier and walked a little faster after dark. The idea of the safe American city, a place of opportunity and excitement, started to disappear, replaced by a narrative of fear and decline. This wasn't just a media creation, it was a lived reality for millions. The grit and danger of the 70s city became a defining image of the decade, a stark contrast to the clean, optimistic cities of the post-war era. But if the world felt heavy, music became the escape. Rock, soul, funk, and disco filled the airwaves, each offering a different kind of release. Concerts weren't just entertainment, they were communal gatherings, a place for emotional release where thousands could feel connected. Artists sang about confusion, rebellion, love, and loss. They created anthems for a generation trying to make sense of a confusing world. Music didn't pretend everything was okay. It reflected how people actually felt, channeling their frustrations, their desires, and their hopes into powerful, unforgettable songs. That honesty made it essential. It was the decade's soundtrack, and it was loud, vibrant, and unapologetically real. Despite everything, life went on. Families still ate dinner together, gathered around the table to talk about their day. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on, their worlds defined by their neighborhood block, not a screen. Televisions had just a few channels, and because of that, Everyone watched the same shows, creating a shared cultural experience. There were no smartphones, no social media, no constant notifications demanding your attention. Life moved slower, people talked more, argued more, and perhaps they felt things more deeply. It was a more connected, face-to-face existence, where boredom was a part of life and human interaction was the main event. By the late 1970s, something shifted. The country was still struggling, but it was adapting. The chaos and disillusionment of the decade had cleared the ground for new things to grow. New ideas about identity, politics, and culture began to form. New voices, long marginalized, started to emerge in music, film, and literature, demanding to be heard. A different America began to take shape. The old certainty was gone, but so was blind obedience. The 1970s didn't offer easy answers. Instead, they forced reflection, asking tough questions about who we were and what we wanted to become. The 1970s were uncomfortable, unstable, and unforgettable. They taught Americans that power can fail, that truth matters, and that progress isn't always a smooth, straight line. It was a decade of harsh lessons learned in gas lines, voting booths, and living rooms across the country. Some decades entertain us, others shape us. The 1970s did both, and America has never been the same since. Thanks for watching. If you found this look back interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore our past.